A very warm welcome to everybody joining us for this, the fifth in our series of live webinars. We are transitioning into the new world, hoping at all times that the old world is going to be back sooner rather than later. But in the meantime, we have to adapt. And one of the ways in which many sports have chosen to adapt is to focus once again, or perhaps just with a sharper glint in their eye, on the world of esports. So this is a timely webinar, and I am thrilled and delighted to be joined by three individuals in the first stage, and then by two more as we progress through the coming hour. We're joined by Trev Keane, who is probably Ireland's leading expert in this field of esports. He's been treading this path now for a number of years, and it has always been a pleasure to work with you, Trev, on the various different events and things like that you did. The best named event as well, FEC down in Kilkenny as well. I do remember that on the fan engagement side. Delighted to have you here with us today. Jonny Madill from Sheridans Sport as well, looking at the international side. And again, I've done a number of different things with you, Jonny, and it has always been a pleasure, always come away smarter having had a conversation with you. And then our third participant today, perhaps the one that we want to hear from most, because it's the one that's most relevant in that crossover between the traditional world and the modern world, is Enda Lynch, who is in charge of enterprise and development down in Munster Rugby, who announced last week on Carried On Sport for Business that Munster Rugby was going into the e-gaming world as well. So we'll be kicking off our conversation. A few little housekeeping things. Down at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A button. We will have an opportunity to take questions from the floor, the virtual floor, towards the end of today's event. And please do make sure that you get your questions in there. We'll try and get through as many of them as we possibly can. We will be joined a little bit later by a good friend, Joanne O'Riordan, and by Stuart Dempsey of Insomnia Gaming Festival for a little announcement on an event which is going to be taking place in the coming weeks as well. But before we get to that, I just wanted to run through some very quick highlights from my perspective as an outsider to the world of esports, but as somebody who has long had an interest in it without a full engagement, and some of the things which I think you might find of interest in regards to this. So just bear with me now 1 second while we move into a world of sharing a screen now, and just to run through some of the elements that I think are perhaps the most important. The Formula One E-Grand Prix. I've watched the two of them now with the family on Sunday nights over the past number of weeks. The first one, which took place in Melbourne, it was the Vietnamese Grand Prix, but it wasn't in the 2019 game version. It attracted 3.2 million viewers for what was basically a computer game being played by a few of the Formula One players or drivers and other assorted guests. The second thing is that yesterday, Facebook launched a dedicated app specifically towards the streaming of Facebook gaming. Number three, the estimated e-gaming audience in 2020, 495 million people around the world that are both watching and playing in the world of esports. 70% of those are more interested and more dedicated in terms of time, commitment, spend in esports than with traditional sports. Number five, we carried the story last week that BMW announced in April that it was sponsoring 5 of the top esports teams in the world. So when brands like that get involved, and they are far from being the only one, it is always a notice, like a canary down a mine. This is something which we all need to be involved in. Number 6, Bilibili. I'm sure you've all heard of them. They paid $113 million for a 3-year deal to broadcast the League of Legends World Championships just to a Chinese audience. Number 7, 236 million more hours of content streamed on Twitch last month as opposed to in February. That's not as opposed to this time last year or this time 10 years ago. It was 236 million hours more in March than in February of 2020. And finally, because it generally comes down to money at the end of the day, the revenue forecast for 2020 by Newzoo, an estimated 1.79 billion US dollars. And with all of that in mind, I want to bring in our experts here. Jonny, you've been living this world for a number of years now. The rest of us are beginning to catch up, but just how big on an international basis is this now? Was this a month ago, and will this be in 6 months' time?
Yeah, it's interesting because we've probably seen this trend for about 3 or 4 years, certainly in the Irish context and more broadly in the European context, of the crossover that you talk about between, on one hand, the world of traditional mainstream sport that we're also familiar with, and then this polarized world of esports and professional video gaming. But that crossover, or that convergence, has been sort of building at pace through the years. And I think the period we're in at the minute is potentially very, very significant in the acceleration of that crossover. In that, if we think about esports as a business or a standalone industry, it's inherently a digital business. So it relies on online content. Unlike traditional sport, it doesn't rely on live events in stadiums and venues. It doesn't rely on match day revenue and gate receipts, and it doesn't rely on broadcast revenue. So all of those challenges that every traditional sport is facing at the minute in the current environment, esports doesn't really need to worry about that because it's so nimble and flexible. And I think what that means is esports is probably better placed, I think, than almost any other sector, certainly within entertainment and sport, to not just survive the environment we're in at the minute, but continue to scale. And I think that's the scary bit, and some of the numbers that you drew out were very telling, in that esports as an industry is actually growing and scaling, whilst almost every other sector is either on pause or potentially regressing. And I suppose the byproduct of that is viewership levels and the sheer numbers of eyeballs on esports and gaming content have skyrocketed in the last 3 to 4 weeks. And I think the increase in Twitch viewership that you alluded to there, Rob, I think is the highlight for me, in that I think it was a 72% increase in concurrent viewers, as you said, from February until April. I mean, that's staggering. And I suppose going back to the crossover piece between esports and traditional sport, we're probably now at a stage where we've got this audience that is living and breathing sport and entertainment, but doesn't have any live sport to engage with. So there's a massive void to be filled. And I think where we're probably now at is that esports and video gaming is filling that void. And we have almost a migration of an audience from live sport across to esports and gaming.
And do you think, does it actually have, you mentioned the fact that it's nimble enough to actually cope with this, but that level of significant growth and interest would generally require quite a significant infrastructure development to actually manage it. Is esports geared up for this? Can it cope? Can it accommodate the extra levels of interest, or is there a danger that we might go to look at it and experience something which is actually not as good as the sport would like it to be?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because again, esports is a digital online business, so it therefore doesn't need to rely on the physical traditional infrastructure that traditional sectors have to rely on. And secondly, esports teams and organizations are so much more sophisticated now than what they were probably 2, 3, 4 years ago, if we're having this conversation. And certainly one of the things I've seen in recent months is just the level of maturity and sophistication around how these businesses operate. If we take a typical elite esports team, in many ways, it is no different to an English Premier League football club, in the sense that it will have a high performance department of analysts, coaches, managers, psychologists. It will have a finance department. It will have an enormous social media content team. And also these organizations will on one hand, be professional video gaming outfits with top players on their rosters competing to win competitions and prize money. But interestingly, esports teams are much, much more than just professional gaming outfits. They're also entertainment brands, they're merchandise businesses, they're streaming businesses, they are digital content businesses, they are influencer marketing brands. And what that means is these esports organizations and brands are so much more flexible to deal with, again, the environment we're in at the minute, because they're not reliant on a match taking place in a physical stadium. They're effectively a global entertainment brand.
And a lot of those elements that you've said there would apply equally to traditional sporting organizations. The difference being is that in esports, it's digital first. So all of these things are much more closely aligned and driven by what is happening in the digital world, as opposed to what's happening on the real side. We'll come back to a number of those. Trev, I just want to bring you in here to look at where we are in Ireland in the context of esports, because we've seen that there have been some moves, and yet all of the talk that has been primarily around League of Legends and the other main games and main championships have been focused on Asia or the United States and to a degree in Europe and the UK. And yet we are right up there, aren't we?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I guess if you'd asked me, to use maybe the Twitch thing, if you'd asked me in February where we were, I'd have said we're 70% behind the rest of the, of the world. But I think we've seen a lot of movements in the last, in the last few weeks. Obviously, Munster, we'll get to it in a few minutes, but we've seen some other sports take initiatives as well around this, Cycling Ireland, looking at, at Swift. So in the sports simulation space, we've moved up. And I think we had a lovely emerging scene at grassroots level around in esports, around League of Legends, around Overwatch. We've some fantastic FIFA players, like the number one player in the MLS, for example, is from Galway. So the talent is there. What hasn't been there before is probably the opportunity or the platform. To give some context around Ireland, Ireland's in a very unique position in that, you mentioned Facebook Gaming, but a lot of the big developers and a lot of the big companies have their headquarters in Ireland. Riot, Blizzard, EA, they're all here spread around the country. So we really are at the focal point of it. And I think what we're starting to see now is the opportunity for the players that have, grafted away for the last 5 years, coming to the fore. And, that's only going to increase. And to be fair, it's been led by Munster and some of the decisions they've made over the last few weeks to move into that space.
Okay. Perfect link, really, to bring you in, Enda, to talk about this. I mentioned at the top of the show about how your move makes it very real for an awful lot of Irish sporting organisations, that you're backing a team that will be competing in League of Legends as opposed to competing in an electronic version of rugby. That's a significant step, both for you to have taken as an organisation and for us to understand as to the thinking behind it. I'd love to hear what was the genesis of the idea and where did it come from?
Yeah, mute.
Sorry, I was on mute. Apologies. Greetings from Cork. Look, the reasons behind this, I mean, it's no secret that live sports audiences are an older demographic, and that demographic is not getting any younger anytime soon. Apart from one or two standout live events a year. And when I first realised the significance of the crossover between sport and esports I was in New York about 18 months ago, and I met with the Mets, and they had just spent $10 million buying, I think it was the Overwatch franchise before the Call of Duty one. And they showed me, there was a game going on that afternoon, and they showed me the audience, the age of the audience that was going into the stadium that afternoon, and it was an aging audience. And they said, if you want your brand to survive with a younger audience, you're going to have to reach out and bring them in to your core product, but reach out to where they are right now. And that was some of the thinking behind it for us. And, Feeling Gaming with Kieran Walsh and others are doing great work in establishing an esports ecosystem in Ireland, outside of the developers who are all coming to be based in Ireland for a variety of reasons. But there's a decent ecosystem here, and we realized now was the opportunity over the last 6 months for us to begin to dip our toe. We don't have $10 million. Rugby's at a standstill at the moment. We all know that. We don't have the financial clout of Barcelona or Besiktas or others. So we were able to identify a way in which we could create a really positive relationship with Kieran, and move in now as to the
Okay, we just we're just losing the signal from you there for a moment, Enda. We'll come back to you.
I can explain on the team if you want, on the structure, if that helps.
Yeah, can you do that?
Yeah. So he's mentioned Kieran Walsh there from Feeling Gaming. So Kieran and Feeling Gaming take part in the UKLC. And the UKLC is run by LVP, which is a Spanish company. And they're a tournament organizer, and Riot Games. And it features, 6 of the I suppose the academy teams of some of the biggest esports teams in the UK, Fnatic with the BMW and Excel. So it's split into 2 splits, and it leads into the EU Masters, which would be like the Champions League of League of Legends. On top of that, what's just been announced after the Munster Rugby news was that Munster Rugby Gaming will take part in the NLC, and that's the Nordic League Championship, which is it includes the UK teams, but it also includes the Nordic teams from Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Finland. And for an extra context around that, when we look at esports, a lot of Asian teams and US teams get mentioned, but it's actually Scandinavian teams have led the way as well from a European sense. Denmark, for example, has really grasped the esports world and would probably be the European leader. So to have that opportunity to compete against those teams is just a huge jump for Feeling and for Munster Gaming. So that's the context of that team and where they're at.
Okay, we're back with you now, I think. And sorry, it must have been the signal bouncing off of those lovely, luscious vegetation behind you there. That context, which, as Trev has painted it, so this is the equivalent of it's probably the Guinness Pro 14 as opposed to the Heineken Champions Cup at the moment. Yep. But the view is that if Feeling Gaming, or as they are now known, Munster Rugby Gaming, does well, that you could progress to be playing in the biggest leagues. Like, what do you hope to gain from it? What's the end game from a Munster Rugby perspective in terms of being involved?
Once the end game, and to go back at it, I'm not sure if you picked up on one of the first points I made. It's about building a brand for a younger audience that's relevant for a younger audience. That is what Munster Rugby Gaming is going to try and do. To go back to Jonny's point earlier on this morning, there is a number of teams out there who are effectively operating the same system as a sports team, as a high-performance sports team. Now, we know what high-performance sports looks like. An awful lot of esports teams are beginning to come up to that level. We hope that our expertise, we can transfer some of that to Kieran and the team that he's building in Munster Rugby Gaming, and bring them up a level into high-performing athletes in esports. So we know we've knowledge we can transfer, but the ambition is long-term. The further up they go, the more people are watching and engaging with our brand, with Munster Rugby, and then we're both winners. And when you're starting off with a great team that has ambitions to grow, and we know we can support them off-screen, for want of a better phrase, then we know that there's a good partnership there to be had.
Okay, and does that support include, sort of hosting the team in a physical sense? I know, Jonny, we were over with you in London lose all track of time now. I think it was last year. And there was just the announcement that one of the key teams was going to be located in Twickenham Rugby Stadium. So they were taking space in there. Is that something that, are you going to be able to provide them with space so that they can bring in the gaming gear and things like that into either Irish Independent Park or Thomond Park?
Ultimately, yeah, I mean, it's not that they'd be housed there every day. There are space constrictions to everything in life. But the reality is, Kieran's team are based around Europe. And when they do come together, we will be able to bring them into our facilities from time to time and make them a part of the Munster Rugby system and give them the same expertise and the same facilities when they need them. But ultimately, the team is based around multiple countries at the moment. So, one step at a time.
Okay. Jonny, coming back to you on the scale of it, like how many teams like this are there competing across Europe and the UK now? If we look at rugby as an example, we've got the 4 provinces in Ireland, we've got top 14 in France, and you've got an elite level. Is that where we're at now with this, with then hundreds of teams feeding into that? Or where does the divide come between me as an individual going on to playing a game online versus being part of a team?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, Enda used the term ecosystem, which I think is quite a good one, and that esports really is it's a vast ecosystem, but it's an umbrella term. And underneath that umbrella of esports, we have dozens and dozens of individual game titles. League of Legends is one, FIFA is another, Overwatch is another, and almost each of those individual game titles have to be treated as their own individual sports, because they each have their own ecosystem of tournaments, competitions, teams, players, etc. And that's something that maybe traditional sectors are still perhaps struggling to get their heads around, particularly when it comes to a brand or a traditional sports team wanting to move into esports in some way, shape or form. And I think the really interesting point about what Munster have done is they have clearly made a conscious decision to enter esports by doing so in League of Legends rather than a simulation sports game. And I would probably class Munster as being a bit of an outlier in that sense. And it's brilliant to see in that we've seen dozens and dozens of sports teams, particularly in UK and in Europe, who have done various things with simulation games like FIFA and other racing games, etc. From a marketing perspective, that's hugely effective. But actually, to align yourselves with a League of Legends team, and bearing in mind League of Legends is one of the probably top 3 mainstream esports game titles, it is almost a step beyond the sort of testing the waters marketing approach. But I think going back to your question, Rob, to understand the esports ecosystem, you almost need to delve into each individual game title and that industry itself, and almost treat esports as being a similar ecosystem to the world of sport, in the same way that we would probably struggle to treat rugby union and football, soccer and GAA in the same conversation. If you're a brand looking to enter sport, as a brand looking to enter esports, you almost have to break down those individual esports game titles and understand what your objectives are.
Okay. And in terms of the seniority of those, like who would be the FIFA or the soccer in an international scale in terms of being the biggest? Would that be League of Legends?
It would. So you would probably have League of Legends, you would have a game called Counter-Strike Go, and another game called Dota 2. They traditionally were viewed as the top 3. Now, interestingly, Fortnite, which has become a bit of a phenomenon, has probably joined the top table and has arguably made a top 4, which is interesting in the sense that Fortnite only really arrived a matter of a couple of years ago. Now, Riot Games, as of a couple of weeks ago, have just released a new game called Valorant, and the sheer number of eyeballs on that game in the first couple of weeks has been just mind-boggling. So the really interesting thing about esports that we may touch on later is that you've got new games emerging all the time. You don't really see that in traditional sport. You have, traditional existing sporting infrastructures and hierarchies, whereas in esports, it's constantly moving all the time, which adds another layer of opportunity, I suppose, because the barriers to entry are probably much lower.
Yeah, I saw you nodding there, Trev, in terms of the, the sort of the big three. We're used to talking about the big three and maybe the four here in Ireland, but is that mirrored? Are we adopting the same patterns as internationally in terms of the games that we like to play as individuals in Ireland, or is there information on that?
Yeah, I mean, you look at it in Ireland's sense, and League of Legends would probably be outside of simulation sports, League of Legends would be the most popular. Overwatch then would probably have the next growing community. So it would mirror that. I think a good way to look at it from an Irish perspective and the esports world is, if you go back to the 90s, you would have looked, there was conversations of Wimbledon when they were in the Premier League moving to Dublin. And despite having our own domestic leagues and being involved in sport, there was that appetite to be involved in something that was a bit of a behemoth across the water that was on a global stage. And I think that's, in an Irish sense, that's where esports can go, and that you can join the top table. I mean, if you look at the Call of Duty World Series, for example, there's 12 teams in that. 8 of them are from the US, and then outside of that, Paris and London and Toronto both bought in to be part of that ecosystem, and that's, it really is truly global leagues that we're looking on, and that's where, long term you see the opportunity for Ireland Inc. to be part of that success. And I suppose I just wanted to make another point on what Jonny was saying, is that traditionally, and I know we're talking traditionally in a digital world, but when you look at an esport, what would have happened was a developer or publisher will release a game, and then it ended up in the community that decided if that was going to become an esport or not. They would set up competitive leagues and they would merge from that. But what has happened with evolution, and a lot of these companies have Netflix type models around data, they've actually been able to develop games that are almost esport or competitive first. So Jonny mentioned, Valorant, and its popularity. It's been the most viewed game on Twitch while still in beta mode. And they've developed that to be a pure esport. So that will be one for people to watch in the coming months. He also mentioned Fortnite. Fortnite, it took 7 months to reach 50 million players. It took Apex Legends 29 days last year, and it took Warzone even less than that, 22 days, to reach 50 million players. So your barriers of entry in terms of coming into the space, I say barriers of entry, money is obviously needs to be there, influencer marketers need to be there. But in terms of new esports emerging, it is very easy to say something emerging as a rival to football in the traditional sense.
Those are incredible numbers to actually get that reach out so quickly. When you think of the time that it takes to build even a new tournament within a traditional sport, but to create a whole new game as well. I'm just going to launch a quick little poll, which we'll just leave running there for about 30 seconds, just to get a sense in the room as to where we are on this, as to whether it's higher on your horizon now than it was a month ago, or whether you're really just in the stage of getting to grips with it. I can see those live going up there now. We are. There's nobody has answered that it's not really for me yet, so you haven't turned anybody off it anyway, certainly yet, chaps. 60% yes, and 55, 45 looks like we're in between, definitely on the horizon and just getting to grips with it. That looks as though it's about an even split in there, based on 83% you haven't voted. So that's very good. One of the things that I guess we've talked about the fact of the ecosystem being here. EA Sports, isn't it? They're European based. It's over in Galway. We've got Logitech down in Cork, responsible for an awful lot of the peripherals. You've just created Ireland Esports, Trev, and with a couple of colleagues who I've worked with myself in the past as well. You're looking to bring a sense of governance and propriety almost to the scene here. are we ready for that now? Is this exactly the right moment that a national governing body for esports should be coming to the fore?
Yeah, 100%. I think given the movement in the space and what's coming, it's definitely the right time. In February, there was Europe Esports was established, which was all the federations of European countries coming together for an overall arching organisation. Ireland wasn't involved in any of those conversations because we didn't have the structure there. Likewise, the IESF, which is the International Esports Federation, which again has a lot of members from federations for Europe. They have open dialogues with the Olympic Council on how esports can be part of the future, whether that's Asian Games initially, but right through to full Olympics. And again, Ireland can't be in those conversations because we don't have a governing body. That's at a higher level. I think at a lower level, and I don't mean in terms of priority, but at a more local level, there's no place for anybody to go. If I'm an emerging esports player, you take Josh Giuliano last year. He went to represent Ireland in the Fortnite World Cup. He finished 58 in the world out of 40 million people. He didn't have an infrastructure here. He's not an elite athlete, despite beating, I won't take 58 from 40 million, but you get it. He didn't have the structure here to develop and hone his skills. He had to do it all on his own, an incredible achievement, and that's, that's not the way it should be. Likewise, moving across the pond, you had a player called, his gamer name was Wolfies, 16-year-old kid, and he won 600,000 at that Fortnite World Cup. His mother's on the BBC the next day saying she doesn't know what he does in that room. And look, it's a funny comment, but the thing is, she didn't actually understand the world of it. So I think from an NGB perspective and the development of Ireland esports, it's about putting that structure in place that, players know where to go so they can learn a bit more about the different esports. They can find other people that are at the same level of them, to develop League of Legends teams for future Munster gaming enterprises. They can also, it's about educating parents, and I think that's, a big part of it. It's removing perceptions. And to both Jonny and Enda's point, it is showing that, these are, elite mindsets. They train their body. If you go to, you mentioned the rugby club, if you go to Twickenham and Excel, the players sit down with nutritionists, they sit down with psychologists, they sit down and they work on their fitness, because they understand that that's what you need for higher concentration and that. So that's why it's important. It's also important in terms of, classifications. We see a lot of conversations, about esports being classified as a sport, and whether it sits under that. I mean, I have different views on that, but one of the reasons why people want it classified as a sport is because there's grant opportunities available for sports athletes. There's tax breaks available for sports athletes. There's financial support to become that elite level athlete that they can. And at the moment, esports doesn't have that structure, and that's the idea to provide that for them.
Okay, rapidly developing, I think. I just want to, we've got a couple of questions that are lining up already, and so I want to throw it open to the floor. But just before we do that, and before we enter into some more of the subjects that we've touched on there, I just want to bring in a couple of guests into the show. One of them is Joanne O'Riordan, who many of you will recognise and be aware of from her various different activities, both as a journalist and as an activist under the No Limbs, No Limits banner. There's Joanne down there, and Stuart Dempsey as well, who runs the Insomnia Gaming Festival. And I'm just going to bring Stuart in as well. And we've got an announcement to make. So I'm just going to hand over to you, Joanne, to let us know about a way that perhaps an Irish audience is going to get a greater understanding of what esports is all about. So over to you.
Yeah, so thanks very much, obviously, Rob, for having me on with this panel. It was super interesting. I'm completely new anyways to esports and everything like that. My cousin goes to all the festivals across the world, so that's as far as I got with it. So about a month and a half ago, I suppose, I'm losing concept of time as well. So I do a lot of work kind of with La Liga and things like that. And I got an email from a journalist in The Guardian saying that Borja Iglesias, who plays at Real Betis, was planning an online FIFA charity tournament for the fight against COVID-19, is what it was about. So I was kind of like, all right, kind of thinking, I don't know what I'm going to do with this email, so I was kind of like, I'll wait it out, I'll write it, see what happens. So I tuned in, I watched the tournament along with I think 1 million other Spanish people, and saw that they raised a total of 144,000 for the fight against COVID-19 basically. So I was, like everyone else in a sporting environment, I was sitting a little bit bored off my tree, and I thought, I'll ask Borja maybe how he did it. So popped him an email, and he just kind of brought me through kind of bits and pieces, and then I contacted the GPA saying would Gaelic footballers and hurlers and camogie players and ladies footballers be interested in things like that, and they'd have to send out the feeler. And then I thought, from a tech point of view, I'm absolutely useless. So I contacted Stuart from Insomnia Games in Dublin. My cousin had been to a couple of his festivals, so I thought I'll roll with this, see what happens. And I think Stuart regrets the day I emailed him, because we potentially grew a Frankenstein that we didn't know actually existed. So we're launching it now officially this week, because it's actually my birthday on Friday, and the idea is that we want companies and businesses and the general public to donate for the fight against COVID-19 for the PPE gear that is so desperately needed at the moment. And 100% of the proceeds will be going to the PPE and things like that. So if anyone is interested in getting involved, or if anyone wants to sponsor or throw money, or even has any expertise or anything and they're willing to guide us, they can definitely pop us an email, and hopefully they all tune in on the Maybank holiday weekend to see which county reigns supreme. And as a football fan, I'm hoping it's football that reigns supreme in Cork especially. So
I won't say anything about how it would be nice for Cork to get an All-Ireland, because of course you won the under-20 last year, beating Dublin, so we'll say nothing about that. Stuart, just coming to you, how is this going to work? What's what's it going to look like? Who are we going to see playing? How are we going to be able to actually make a contribution?
Well, it's fantastic to be a part of it. Obviously, Joanna's the driving force with her enthusiasm. So it's going to be run over the weekend of the 1st to the 3rd of May. We're currently liaising with the GPA, who've been fantastic. They've been so proactive in getting involved, getting their members on board. They've told us that the feedback from players has been fantastic. Obviously, young athletes, a lot of them are involved in gaming, particularly FIFA. It'll be a very common game for young sports people to be playing. So the interest from the players has been very, very strong, which is fantastic. I think we've over 40 players signed up to date, and expecting more to join, which is absolutely brilliant. The tournament itself will take place on the 1st to the 3rd of May. So it will be streamed live over the course of the weekend to the Insomnia Games Festival YouTube and Facebook pages. So the public will be able to view the fixtures live online, and we're hoping then that they will contribute donations to the chosen charity, obviously raising money for PPE for frontline healthcare workers, as Joanne alluded to. So it's coming together really well, and to echo what the guys are saying, it's great to see this crossover now between traditional sporting organisations like the GPA, who are seeing value in esports, and particularly this charity endeavour. So we're going to have the final in, obviously, on the Sunday evening. Whether it's a hurler, whether it's a footballer, or which counties will make it, we're not quite sure yet. And then ultimately, from my own perspective, I'd love to have them back. We're building towards our event at the RDS in November, and maybe we can have them back for a replay there, a bit of a grudge match, and maybe the fundraising can continue until that point. So it's coming together really, really well, and really looking forward to it.
Great. I guess the only thing that would stop that would be if they're still involved in an All-Ireland Championship, perhaps in November or into December.
Indeed.
We live in a world where we can't forecast what's going to happen tomorrow, never mind in a couple of months. But that is exciting, and it's going to be launched tomorrow, so you'll be able to read all about it on Sport for Business tomorrow as well. Say nothing to anybody who's in the room now at the moment. This is just a little exclusive for you. So a big thank you to Stuart, and a massive thank you as always to Joanne. Your enthusiasm means that this will be a success, regardless as to what it is or how it looks. So I'm going to say goodbye to the two of you now, and we're going to go back into the questions now. So they've been coming in, and I guess the first one is really just to bring us back into basics before we get into some of the detail. But Emer Moriarty Crowley, fascinating webinar. Thanks very much. I'm a complete newcomer to this. Could one of the panel explain just the how of this? Who are the players and what is the game? Now, I think what is the game? We've talked about that in terms of the big three of League of Legends and Overwatch and things like that. Demographically, between Trev and Jonny, maybe tell us who is your esports player.
I'll have a go, and then Trev, you can probably correct me and give a more accurate definition. It's a good question. I think the first point to make is sort of jumping back to one of the previous points. It's tempting to generalize around what an esports fan looks like from a demographic perspective, because again, we're dealing with lots of different types of games. So, a typical rugby fan is maybe going to be different to a typical golf fan, for example. But based on the data, the demographic of the esports audience is, first of all, probably 16 to 35. Secondly, predominantly male, albeit the split, the male-female split, is certainly starting to balance out, which is positive, and a lot of good work is being done in that regard. And thirdly, it's an audience with disposable income, which I think is an important point, in that esports fans are prepared to actually spend money on content. But I suppose how we would describe the demographic is it's the very audience, and Enda alluded to it earlier on, is the very audience that every traditional sports team or body or brand is trying to engage with and probably struggling to engage with, which is why that crossover is accelerating, because every traditional sport and brand sees the opportunity to tap into such a valuable demographic. Okay, very good. Trev, that side of things, I'm very conscious. It was great to have Joanne in. I'm very conscious of the fact that we're four blokes who are actually talking about this, and so when we come back to it in part two, I want one of our women ambassadors from esports to be part of it as well. But is that, like Jonny has mentioned there, the fact that there are moves in that sphere? I know at home my two sons would be more inclined towards the gaming side of it than my two daughters, but the younger daughter is more inclined than the older daughter. So, where is that shift going to come from?
So again, just to go back for a small bit, and it might help, with the question. The term esports, for me, it's like saying, Olympics. You don't play Olympics. It's an umbrella term above it all. Underneath it, you have all the different games like you would have in an Olympics, but instead of games, they're just publishers, and each of those publishers then release different titles. So that's kind of your top-down, approach on it. In terms of female participation, it's actually very game dependent. So when you get to, we talk about the sports simulation, very, very male orientated games, 16 to 35. But as you move across to something like Fortnite, for example, the male dominance does begin to dwindle. In the US, for example, in Fortnite, you're looking at a 61-39% split in terms of male to female. And where it gets very interesting, and this will be probably the evolution of gaming and esports, is when you come to mobile games. Female participation actually increases a lot. and it's up as high as 49% depending on some of the games. So almost a 50-50 split. It does very much depend on the title, and it very much does depend on the game. But unlike we'd say traditional sport, that there shouldn't be any of those barriers. Like for example, in some work I've done with some other teams in the UK, the focus has been bringing on female FIFA players. And there was history made earlier on this year when one of those females qualified for Crystal Palace's E-Premier League qualifier, becoming the first female to do so. And there was absolutely, no differentiator between her skill levels between her and a male, and she was well able for it. So again, the barriers do not need to be there for female participation, in esports. In Denmark, for example, you've got an all-female CSGO tournament, and you also have an over 65 league that is a mix of male and females. So there is great opportunities for inclusivity across it. I guess we're just not. I suppose we're not seeing it in a mainstream environment or in a competitive environment just yet. Okay.
But less barriers to overcome maybe than in traditional sport, which is being made more equal. I've got a couple for you, Enda. One from Vicky Donlan at Leopardstown. She asks, the ambition, obviously, of Munster attracting more fans towards rugby from the esports audience. Is there any research to support the ambition, or are you taking a flyer on this, do you think?
I mean, to go back to what Jonny and Trev have said, and what I alluded to earlier, the research is there that the audience 35 plus or 35 and under is not attracted to live sport the way it used to be. And we see the numbers are very much attracted to gaming in all facets. There was some great research released by Teneo earlier this year, which showed that the number one and the two top sports, let's call esports a sport, the two top sports that are growing at the moment in terms of attention and interest are NBA and esports. And you've got to recognize that is a growing audience, and all the demographics behind that research showed it was under 35. So the audience is there. They participate in their system. Can we make that crossover and bring them back to rugby? That's up to us, and that's the work, and that's the strategy we've laid out, and that's a mixture of events and in-game branding and things like that we have to work on over the next couple of years to bring that connection to life for people. But we know we can do it, but it's not going to be a today or tomorrow thing. This is a long-term play by Munster Rugby, as it has been for every other sports organisation.
Okay, one more from Hamish Adams, CEO of Athletics Ireland, and a man known to you certainly within Cork sporting circles. But outside of that growth, outside of that reach into it, is there a plan to monetize the relationship?
Yeah, long term there is, but you've got to grow your audience first, and then when you have an audience that is engaging with Munster Rugby, not just in our core, which is rugby on the pitch, but in esports and in all the facets that we're going to get engaged in, you make your brand much more appealing to a wider number of sponsors or potential sponsors, to a wider number of engagements around merchandise and advertising. So you're growing your audience so that you can then go back to the traditional sponsorship, advertising, merchandise in those areas and begin to monetize in that front. But we've got to grow our audience first, and that's what stage one is all about.
Okay, we were chatting beforehand, Trev, as well, about some of the value of the deals on kit sponsorship of teams like that as well.
Yeah, in terms of kit sponsorships and everything, I mean, we're not quite at the level that you would see for a Liverpool or a Man United, but I think it's certainly very, very interesting. And again, just to give an example, there was a team that I worked with last year, a FIFA team, an esports team, that designed a virtual kit that was in the EA FIFA game, and as of the end of March, there's been 6 million games that has been played with that kit, and that was part of their the activation. So for a very low cost investment, that's a very high return in my view. So the opportunities are there, they're emerging. like I'm coming into my 6th year working on it. I have never, ever, I'll say ever again, had had a phone call or an email from an Irish brand or agency, and I had 5 last week. So it just goes to show that it is starting to move into a mainstream conversation, you know. So it's very interesting, you know.
Okay, that's interesting. Noel Martin from Core sponsorship is asking that question, sort of making the point that maybe it's not being treated as seriously as, you know, real sport, or in an Irish context in particular, and maybe that's in a UK context as well. But you obviously think that we're on the cusp of doing it. What do you think might be a trigger for actually making that move so that the 5 becomes 10, becomes 50 conversations?
I think it's you know, the first part, it's about understanding the opportunity. It's having, you know, a framework and a structure. I mean, again, to go back to Munster gaming, and the appeal for Munster gaming is that you've got an Irish gaming audience that likes League of Legends, but you're also part of a UK league, and you're part of a Nordic league. So you've got incredible reach at a domestic and a Northern European level, which is fascinating. I think you have, and then underneath that, you know, at some point, Munster are going to have to develop a talent identification program to find top Irish League of Legends players, which in itself will create an AIL almost of League of Legends, you know, which again puts another layer onto that and puts another set of structure in place. So it's definitely very, very early in an Irish sense. It's definitely, but it is on the cusp. And I think, you know, you see initiatives like Joanne and Stuart and what they're doing with the GPA. Extra Time did something with League of Ireland players and FIFA for cystic fibrosis. And I think those kind of initiatives, you know, will help the mainstream conversations as well. You know, once you see kind of everyday athletes using the downtime to take part in, you know, in gaming, it's not the ideal scenario, of course, but what it does is it does lead to a mainstream conversation about it and puts it to the fore.
Okay. If I can add to that, Rob, just for 2 seconds, there's 2 additional points. One is part of the work we'll be doing with Kieran and the team in Munster Rugby Gaming is bringing how they prepare to be a high performing team to life for people, so that they can realize that, you know, all the elements of sport around physical nutrition and psychological support and help that you need to perform at the highest level are also necessary at the highest levels of gaming. And we'll be doing that with them. But also, just to put my Federation of Irish Sport hat on for a second, I see a question on the side here from Morgan Buckley. The work that Trevor and his colleagues are doing in establishing a Federation for Esport in Ireland is critical to gaining momentum at the highest level for esports to be recognised as an official sport and get that journey underway ahead of Paris 2024, when it'll be a demonstration sport. And I think that'll be a real torch light for people to realise that esports is here to stay. It is a sport. It requires an awful lot of pieces around performance as well. And I think we'll see that over the next 3 to 4 years, where Trevor and the team are doing great work in establishing the federation at that level.
It's really important. I remember just a little over 12 months ago, I didn't do it this year. Obviously it wasn't right, but I'd normally like to have a little bit of fun on April Fool's Day. And last year's story was on Sport Ireland building out an esports team to go and take part in international competition, which took in a huge amount of people, more so than in the past. They've got a bit of a record, because I remember 2 weeks before Sky Sports came on board with the GAA, we ran a story saying that they had sold the rights to Al Jazeera, and then all of a sudden Sky Sports came in. This 2 years ago, last year, we did the esports, and maybe that sort of window of April Fool to actual reality is just getting shorter and shorter all the time. Just before we wrap up, just one question left there from Declan Healy at Leopardstown. The role of gambling companies, have they been very much a part of where esports has come, or has that not been the case?
Yeah, I think that the betting gambling piece is an interesting one, in that I suppose the first point to make is that betting markets are available on many esports events, and from a commercial perspective, there are some upsides there because it's another revenue stream, and we've seen the upsides in traditional sport. But the risks and the downsides are obviously integrity and all things integrity related. And in some ways that ties back to Enda and Trev's point about governance. Governance is so critical because of integrity issues like gambling, betting, match fixing, player welfare. And having those governance frameworks in place will make it easier to address issues like gambling and betting, because the reality is betting companies are all over esports and have been for some time, and they're probably not going to go away. But again, that's where governance is so important in putting in place those frameworks and regulating the integrity issues from a player welfare perspective, I suppose.
Okay. Can I add just one point on that? Johnny's 100% right. Look, there are markets on it, but I think where it's different is that, and I'll two examples would be, or three examples would be Riot, EA, and Epic, which don't allow gambling companies in to sponsor their events, in to be partners with teams. So it's, while it is on the an accessory or on the periphery of esports, it's not part of the entertainment. So if you watch a stream on Twitch, or if you watch the Formula One esports, or you watch an EA thing, you won't have, in the same way that you might watch a football thing, or even GA, for example, you don't see the betting ads, to the fore in it during the experience on it. So there's no front of jersey opportunities. There's no, so it is very protected in that sense, because there is a recognition of the audience, but definitely around the peripheries, there is the gambling element.
Okay, I'm conscious of the time now. We always like to get people in and out on the hour. So I guess really just before we finish up with you guys, a forecast, a sort of a short-term forecast, and just how big this could become. We've already been watching, sort of simulated Formula One games on Sky Sports over the last couple of weeks. Do you imagine that we're getting close to the time, as part of the overall sporting context, where we might actually see esports appearing on our live, sort of public sector or free-to-air broadcasters at some point in 2020? I'll throw that one to you, Jonny, first of all, from an international perspective.
Yeah, I suppose from a slightly more objective perspective, looking at Irish esports generally, I think what is very noticeable is that for the first time, probably ever, we now have a mature standalone esports industry developing in Ireland, and previously that really wasn't the case. It was a very young, nascent industry. So we now have that sort of structured ecosystem. Now that is obviously very positive from all of those integrity governance perspectives, but it's also very positive from a commercial point of view, because brands will be much more comfortable entering the space, because it's much easier to build a narrative in a space where there is a structured calendar, what competitions exist, who the leading teams are. So actually, I think we're going to see a bit of a snowball effect. And I think we've sort of reached the point with the governance piece and with Munster Rugby's move, that Irish esports is now probably just going to continue to build momentum, and it's probably only a matter of time before we see others entering the space. The conversation or the debate on media rights is a really interesting one, in that esports has never really needed traditional broadcasters, because all of the content has been accessible on a streaming platform called Twitch for free at any time, and fans aren't used to paying subscriptions for content. The reality is that may start to change, and in fact that probably is starting to change, because a bit like the Netflix Amazon model, fans are now more willing to have a sort of pick and mix approach to accessing the top premium content. But there's still a challenge there in that, if you take Premier League football across the water, so reliant on broadcast revenue, that's not really the case in esports. So it's a very different world. Okay.
We don't want to crash into the rest of the schedule. So I'll just take the opportunity to thank Trev, Keane, Jonny, Madill, and Enda, Lynch, as well as Joanne and Stuart, who joined us earlier. This has been the 5th of our webinar series. The 6th one is coming up on Thursday morning. We'll be looking at sponsorship activation, and we've got a stream of them. We're going to be every Tuesday, every Thursday between 11 and 12 for the foreseeable future. We don't want this to go on forever, but we need to make sure that we have got some content to bring to you, the Sport for Business community. Our daily news digest keeps on landing every morning, and we are producing additional content each afternoon as well. But for now, this has been a wonderful start point. I'm pretty sure that we're going to be coming back for another tilt at the world of esports in the coming weeks, possibly months, and that it will be a materially different conversation, and that Ireland will hopefully be very much to the fore in that. So again, thank you to Trev, to Jonny, to Enda, to Joanna and Stuart, and to all of you for joining us this morning.
Thank you.